Chyna broke the mould and rewrote the rules of women's wrestling in the late 90s. But after she was rejected by WWE, Joanie Laurer's life took a very different path. Away from the wrestling business, she struggled with fame, addiction and isolation. Today we're taking a look at the sad story of Chyna's life after WWE. Joanie Laurer made her WWF debut in 1997 as the enforcer for D-Generation X, but she really wanted to step between the ropes herself and she wanted to wrestle the men. At first, Vince McMahon hated the idea, but then they started working out together. Vince was surprised at how strong Joanie was and how much she could lift, and so he changed his mind and started booking her in matches with the men on the roster. 1999 was Chyna's year. Her popularity went through the roof. She became the first woman to enter the Royal Rumble, and she became the one and only woman to ever become Intercontinental Champion. As the first woman in the WWF to be presented as equal to the men, she started getting noticed by the mainstream media. She was on magazine covers, talk shows, sitcoms, and she became a figure of empowerment for girls everywhere. In just a few years, she became a celebrity in her own right as she crossed over into the mainstream. And Chyna had her eyes on an even bigger prize. She wanted to be the first female WWF champion. In the year 2000, Playboy magazine approached her with an offer to pose nude for them. This is when Vince McMahon decided to step in. He told her in no uncertain terms that if she went ahead with the photo shoot, then she'd never be crowned WWF champion. It was a tough choice for Joanie. That one Playboy shoot promised more money than she'd ever earned in her entire wrestling career, so she decided to take the offer. And that would be the one biggest mistake of her entire career. Vince was furious and he immediately put a stop to her wrestling men, and he forced her into the Divas division, which was a terrible fit for her. She was far too big and strong to have realistic matches with any of the other women on the roster, and there was now a huge amount of tension between Joanie and the old man. She'd gone from working out with him in the gym to him barely saying a word to her, and on top of that, her contract was about to come up for renegotiation. She was already in a weakened position, and she immediately made it worse by demanding a guaranteed $1 million. Even if she hadn't already pissed off the boss, that was the kind of money that was reserved for the Steve Austins on the roster. But the final nail in the coffin of her WWF career was her personal life. She'd once had a passionate relationship with Triple H, but it had recently ended in the most heartbreaking way possible. Triple H left her to start dating Stephanie McMahon, Vince's daughter. All of these factors led to Joanie being released from the WWF in late 2001, and it was like the floor dropped out from underneath her entire existence. Before she joined the Federation, Joanie had meandered throughout her life, struggling to find a purpose. She'd fallen out with her mother and lost contact with her sister, but in the WWF, she'd found a surrogate family and a sense of belonging. She'd even considered Vince the father figure that she'd never had while she was growing up. But now there was a black hole where all of that used to be. She did realise that she needed to quickly capitalise on her wrestling fame if she wanted to earn any money outside the business. She'd really enjoyed the cameos that she'd made in various TV shows over the years, so she moved to California with the dream of becoming an actor. But it was tough going. All she managed to get was a few walk-on parts here and there, and everyone seemed far less interested in her now she wasn't a WWF superstar. The lack of work caused Joanie to panic, and so she started to drink heavily to take away her anxiety. And then Sean Waltman arrived at her door. The man known to wrestling fans as X-Pac had also been released from WWE thanks to his substance abuse issues. Joanie and Sean started dating, and they soon spiralled into abusing alcohol and drugs together. Soon after, she got the opportunity to work for New Japan Pro Wrestling, and so they both moved to Tokyo in 2002. New Japan boss Antonio Inoki promised Joanie that she would be booked in matches against men, which she was very happy about. Her career led up to a big main event match against Japanese legend Masahiro Chono at the Tokyo Dome. It seemed like Joanie was going to have a big resurgence in Japan, but things quickly went off the deep end. Her and Sean's substance abuse issues hadn't stopped when they moved to Tokyo. In fact, it just got worse. This led to Joanie missing shows and personal appearances, and Antonio Inoki soon realised that she was trouble. He couldn't afford to have a drug scandal on his hands because of her, and so he cut her loose. With no other choice, Joanie and Sean came back to the US and became addicted to crystal meth. Desperate for money, they released a homemade porn video called One Night in Chyna that reportedly earned Joanie $100,000. She later claimed that the distributor screwed her over on the payment, but either way, it was a bad decision to take part, because the movie generated a huge amount of negative attention for Joanie that far outweighed any money that she might have made from it, and so she further spiralled into a pit of depression. And she might not have realised it at the time, but her decision to release this video negatively affected her chances of ever going back to WWE. It wasn't long after that she was charged with physically assaulting Sean, and their relationship came to an end. At this time, Joanie's sister Kathy had been back in touch with her, concerned for her well-being. In interviews, Kathy said that Joanie was in total denial about her drink and drugs problem, and she refused to take any help on the subject. They got into a huge argument, and Joanie stormed out, and the siblings never saw each other ever again. Out of desperation, Joanie agreed to appear in a string of reality TV shows, often embarrassing herself by showing up intoxicated. This was around the time that she legally changed her name to Chyna in the hope that it would help her to get work. WWE still owned the copyright to the name Chyna, but changing it to her legal name allowed her to use it professionally. Many thought that she'd reached rock bottom when she appeared on Celebrity Rehab in a failed attempt to get clean. Dr. Drew Pinsky was the lead specialist on the show, and he spent a lot of time trying to help Chyna. In an interview years later, he said that she was struggling deeply with unresolved trauma. Her personality and behaviour could change dramatically in different environments, almost like she was a different person. It made me worry about undiagnosed conditions, but she never fully committed to treatment. She resisted addressing her substance abuse and mental health struggles, and despite sending her to specialists, she wouldn't follow through. It's heartbreaking because it didn't need to happen. She was complicated but a lovely person, and she deserved better care in a system that often failed people like her. In 2011, she had another chance to get back into the wrestling business as she appeared for TNA. She teamed up with Kurt Angle to face Jeff and Karen Jarrett at Sacrifice, where she made Karen tap out to an ankle lock. It was great to see Chyna back in the ring, and she entered into negotiations for a long-term contract with the company. But it soon came to light that she'd signed a different kind of contract with an adult movie studio, and so TNA dropped her like a stone. The most damaging film that she made was a WWE parody that featured adult stars playing the roles of Triple H, Vince McMahon and Stephanie McMahon. In 2013, Chyna moved back to Japan, where she hoped to start over fresh. In Japan, Chyna became an English teacher, but moving to a different country didn't solve any of her problems. Her mental health continued to get worse, and she was arrested on multiple occasions for breaching the peace. She documented her feelings on her YouTube channel, where she spoke about the deep sense of loneliness that she felt. A couple of years later, she packed up and came home. she agreed to star in a documentary about her life called The Reconstruction of Chyna. This seemed like a turning point in her life. She reconnected with her fans and started attending personal appearances and autograph signings, and she was genuinely surprised about how many people still looked up to her as an icon. In August 2015 at Roddy Piper's funeral, she saw Triple H for the first time in years. Apparently they hugged and they went to one side and had a private conversation together. After decades of not speaking, she reconnected with her mother. They started emailing each other and had even agreed to meet next time she was in town. But just before the reunion, things fell apart. Chyna relapsed and sent her mom a long, angry email that ended their relationship once again. Despite all of this progress that she'd made, she still hadn't defeated her demons. She was constantly making embarrassing posts on Twitter and YouTube around this time, each one more incoherent than the one before. But then Chyna's social media posts went silent and she stopped answering her calls. Her manager went to her apartment to check on her, which is when he found her dead. On her nightstand sat bottles of Valium and Ambien, the prescription medications that she'd relied on for the last few years. It's believed that her death was an accidental overdose rather than suicide. Chyna changed the game for women in wrestling. Her strength, charisma and fearlessness paved the way for the superstars that came after her, even if she never fully got to see the impact that she made. 3 years after her death, WWE put her in the Hall of Fame as part of D-Generation X. But for Joanie, it was too little, too late. Wrestling was the one place that she'd found acceptance, a place that felt like family to her, only for that family to turn its back on her when she needed it the most.